In the last video, we talked about how human body fat has changed over the last 100 years and how an indicator of bad outcomes was something called the desaturase index, or the DI-18. And that's an index of the monounsaturated oleic acid, which is 18 carbons long, over the 18 carbon long saturated fat called stearic acid. This is in 5 individual humans from 1943. So this is the oldest data that we have. These samples are all taken from cadavers. So all 5 of these humans have passed away. The persons in the column with this kind of more brownish color, they have died of what's called atherosclerosis, or heart disease. And you can see that even as long ago as 1943, you could already see that these 2 humans who died of heart disease have a different fatty acid profile in their adipose tissue. They have lower stearic acid. The 3 in the pink that died of something else, their stearic acid is up around 8. These 2, their stearic acid is down below 6. Furthermore, they have a lower, this is linoleic acid, and their levels are lower than most people are between 10 and 11, and those 2 are down below 9. This is 1968 in Germany. They took a bunch of people and they divided them into those under 70 kilograms, that's around 150 or 160 pounds, I think, and those over 70 kilograms. And what they found was that in people over 70 kilograms, you see a similar pattern where saturated fat drops, polyunsaturated fat drops, and monounsaturated fats increase. And so in this video, we're going to talk about why this pattern shows up with increasing obesity or heart disease, where you see decreasing omega-6 polyunsaturated fat, that's decreasing linoleic acid, and you see decreasing stearic acid, and you see increasing monounsaturated fat in those cases. So now we've jumped ahead to 2015, and we're not looking at adipose tissue anymore. Now we're looking at phospholipid composition. So this is the fats that make up the lipid membranes of these people, and you can see the top one is linoleic acid. And remember, in 1943 and 1968, we saw linoleic acid dropping with heart disease and with obesity. And in 2015, you can clearly see linoleic acid is dropping by about 10% in overweight versus lean humans. And if you look at obese versus lean humans, linoleic acid levels drop by about 15%. GLA, this 18,3N6, actually increases as you go from lean to overweight to obese. And this thing called delta 6 desaturase goes from 10 or 0.10 or 0.10, however you want to think about that, to 0.14 in overweight humans, up to 0.15 in obese humans. And this is strongly statistically significant, this increase in delta 6 desaturase as you go from lean to obese. We talked about the DI-18 in the last video, which is a desaturase index. So what is the D6D Index? You consume a polyunsaturated omega-6 fat in your diet called linoleic acid. And that the shorthand notation for that is 18,2N6. And that means it's 18 carbons long, and it has 2 double bonds, and it's one of the quote-unquote omega-6 fats. And like I say, that's called linoleic acid, and it's found in soybeans, also in chicken and pork, of animals that have eaten corn and soybeans. And there's an enzyme called delta 6 desaturase, and that's what this D6D index means. And D6D is a desaturase, as it sounds, makes it less saturated, and so it adds a 3rd double bond, and so this becomes 18,3N6. And so and this is called GLA. And it's worth pointing out there is another 18,3 that you will probably see if you look at some of these studies, called 18,3N3, and that's alpha-linolenic acid. And that's what's found in things like flaxseed oil, for instance. But this GLA is very uncommon in our food. So if you find this in your phospholipid membranes, it more than likely came from linoleic acid being converted by D6D to this GLA. So if we want to calculate what the D6D index is, we make something called the product to precursor ratio. And so 18,3 N6 is the product of this reaction. So that goes on top, 18,3 N6, and we just divide it by the precursor, which is linoleic acid in this case. We divide that by 18,2 N6, and that will give us our D6D index. So one of the reasons that we care about the D6D index, if you are obese, you are 14 times as likely, 14 times, to have a high D6D index, a high delta 6 desaturase index. And all that means is that you're going to have less linoleic acid and you're going to have more GLA, which is that 18,3 N6. I think this topic is super important. I am an Omega Quant affiliate, so you can actually get your D6D index tested. If you go to the Omega Quant website, you want the omega-3 index, the complete test. That's the one that gives you all of the fats. And if you use my coupon code FIRE, you can see you'll save $10 when you check out, and a great discussion site to discuss your Omega Quant results and ask questions and compare yourself to other people who have taken this same test is over at reddit.com/r/saturated fat. This is an example of a test result that someone got from Omega Quant and posted on the R saturated fat. You can see that the test results from this is really in depth. You get all the saturated fats, you get all the polyunsaturated fats, you get all the different monounsaturated fats, fats that you've never heard of before, and you won't know why they're important, but I'm going to keep talking about it in this video series so that you can start to get an idea of maybe what you're doing well on and what you need work on, right? This is, like I say, these two numbers here, that's linoleic acid, and there's your GLA, 18,3 N6. And like I was saying, you have to be a little bit careful because here's your omega-3 and this is 18,3 N3. You don't want to confuse it with alpha-linolenic acid. But you just divide those two numbers, and I wouldn't compare them necessarily directly with studies that I'm showing in this video, but compare them with other people over on the thread, because then it's apples to apples, because all these tests work a little bit differently. So this paper is very boring, but it's very useful. That what they showed is the correlation between adipose tissue triglycerides, which is here, and these things in your phospholipids, which is kind of the top layer here. The SCD18 index in your adipose tissue is incredibly important, but unfortunately, it doesn't show up as well on the phospholipid tests. But the delta 6 desaturase, and that's what we're talking about in this video, is very well correlated. If you want to look at your levels of SCD1, you can see that SCD1 is actually much better correlated. If you look at the SCD16, so that's the ratio of palmitoleic acid, which is the 16 carbon monounsaturated fat, to palmitic acid, the 16 carbon saturated fat. And so probably the two best numbers, or two of the best numbers off that test, are going to be your SCD16 index and your D6D index. God damn, I just can't see it. And so how important is this D6D index really? Well, this is the EPIC Potsdam study in Germany, where they looked at the phospholipids from thousands of different people, and they correlated them, all of the different fats, to risk outcomes. And so you see this one on top here is linoleic acid, and you can see these people have the least linoleic acid. They only have 9.1% of their phospholipids. And if you were in the lowest groups, then 217 people in the study in this low group developed diabetes over the next 5 years. If you if you come over here, you can see people have 12.4, so that's quite a bit more linoleic acid. Only 82 of them develop diabetes. Then if you look down here, we have this GLA, that's the 18,3N6, and in the lowest group, people only have 0.027, and only 56% of them develop diabetes. If we go over here, then these people have 0.09, which is a little over 3 times more, and 237 of them develop diabetes. And so you can see that having low linoleic acid and having high GLA is a bad combination. And that is exactly, of course, what is determined by the delta 6 desaturase activity, is the ratio of course, GLA over linoleic acid. And if you have the lowest D6D index, or people in the study with the lowest index, only 47 of them develop diabetes over the course of the test. And if you have the highest D6D, then 264 people develop diabetes. So this D6D is a massive predictor of diabetes risk. We're talking 6 or 7-fold there, I think. In this study, they also did what's called a Mendelian randomization. So in a Mendelian randomization, they actually look at your genetics along with the outcomes in the study, and that gives them a better idea of which things are actually causing diabetes rather than just being associated with diabetes. It's possible that D6D is merely associated with diabetes, but the Mendelian randomization result suggests that it actually is part of the causal problems with diabetes. And so here I've just added to our list one more. This is the SCD16. You can see 16.1 over 16.0. That can also be, of course, found on your omega quant test. And people with the lowest of this reading only had 65 of them develop diabetes. Whereas if you were high on this reading, 245 people developed diabetes. And so these desaturase index are very predictive of oncoming diabetes. If that wasn't enough, here's delta 6 desaturase links polyunsaturated fatty acid metabolism with disease progression and heart failure. And you can see compositional analysis of phospholipid from hearts explanted from patients with dilated cardiomyopathy revealed elevated polyunsaturated fatty acid product to precursor ratios. Remember, we talked about what that means. Reflective of D6D hyperactivity. People with heart disease have high D6D activity. This study is about depressive disorders. So these are people with clinically diagnosed depression. And in those patients, you see increased concentrations of palmitoleic acid. So that's 16.1 monounsaturated fat, and total monounsaturated fatty acids, with a decreased proportion of total polyunsaturated fats, or omega-6 PUFA. And if you think about that German study that I showed you, where you saw linoleic acid decreasing as monounsaturated fat was increasing in people who were obese, they're describing that exact same scenario in the first sentence of the results of this paper. They also find that the index of D6D activity was significantly increased in phosphatidylcholine and cholesterol esters, and that means in your membrane phospholipids. And so this D6D activity, if you want to find one thing, one kind of score that unifies all of the modern diseases that we have, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, depression, you could find worse places to start than thinking about D6D. This table is kind of graph of what happens with linoleic acid metabolites. Also, you've probably heard of them maybe as oxylipins or oxylipids or oxlams, which is oxidized linoleic acid metabolites. So you eat, this is linoleic acid here. You see that 18.2. Again, that comes from soybean oil. This is the thing, this linoleic acid, remember, is the thing that's dropping when you see the D6D index rising. And so that's weird. And so, of course, on my blog and in my videos, I'm always telling you not to eat linoleic acid. And so it seems kind of weird or ironic that I'm saying that if linoleic acid levels drop, that's bad. But here's the reason why. So in most of those studies, if you take a large enough sampling of the population in any given area, you can assume that everyone on average in both your control group and your experimental group are eating about the same amount of linoleic acid, because as long as you take a large enough section of the population, everybody on average gets the same amount. And so when you see people's linoleic acid levels drop, it's not because they're eating less typically. It's usually because their enzymes have changed. And what you can see here is that delta 6 delta is the first step in converting linoleic acid to GLA, which isn't even shown in this. Ultimately, it gets it gets 2 more carbons added and it becomes 23, which is DGLA. And then there's a second desaturase enzyme, or actually a third desaturase, counting SCD1, that turns D5D into arachidonic acid. And that arachidonic acid goes into your phospholipid membranes. And from there, there's all of these reactions that can turn it into all of these oxidized things. You can see here this 5-HETE. So this is upregulated 24 times in obese versus lean humans. That's 24 times higher. That's not a typo. This is 5-oxo-HETE. It's made from 5-HETE. And you can see that it's almost 7 times higher in obesity. This 9-HETE is 30 times higher in obesity compared to lean humans. You can see 6 times higher for this 11-HETE. The problem is when you see those linoleic acid levels dropping, that's the first step on the pathway to becoming this. That declining linoleic acid ultimately results, right, in high 5-HETE. if you just follow all of these arrows. And so that's the problem. And when you see that increase in the 18.3 N6, which is the D6D Index, that means that the first step in this process, the rate limiting step in this process, really is delta 6 desaturase here. And so when the activity of this goes up, you know that all of these things are going to be higher, right? This is just a second study showing the same thing. Obesity is positively associated with 5 and 11-HETE, and you see that individuals with 5-HETE concentrations greater than 5 nanomolar were over 5 times more likely to be obese compared to those with 1.86 nanomolar, and the same thing is true of 11-HETE. So hopefully, without getting too far into the weeds on this, I want to just talk briefly about why it is that these things are causing this obesity. And so one of the things you've heard me talk before probably about PPAR gamma is a lipogenic transcription factor. It turns on genes that make you fat, essentially. This is that 5-oxo-HETE, which was elevated around 7 times in obesity. And this is a test of PPAR activity. Here's the negative control here about this level. And if you add this 5-oxo-HETE, the activity is probably tripled of this PPAR gamma. The same thing is true of 11-HETE. You see a tripling of activity. See, that's going up, that's going up. And once you get to 15-HETE, that's probably 4 or 5 times more active. And so these oxidized linoleic acid metabolites are activating PPAR gamma. Another thing that they're doing is they're activating something called NF-kappa beta. And so I haven't talked much or really at all about inflammation on my blog, and there's reasons for that, and we're going to get more into that, especially stuff with NF-kappa beta. But you can see that these things like this 5-HETE here, that actually binds to NF-kappa beta, which is a pro-inflammatory transcription factor, and it increases its activity by about 3 or 4-fold. And this 12-HETE increases the activity of NF-kappa beta by about almost 15-fold. And it has 2 different, NF-kappa beta has different subunits. All of these things are increasing the activity level of the pro-inflammatory transcription factor NF-kappa beta. And in this experiment, they use this promoter that mildly activates NF-kappa beta. And what you see is when you activate this transcription factor, so this is in the light gray, right? Here's activated NF-kappa beta. This is fatty acid synthase. This is SCD1, right? So that's one of the desaturases. And so this is the thing that converts stearic acid to monounsaturated fat. And you can see with a little bit of activation of NF-kappa beta, which is what 5 heat and 12 heat do, etc., SCD1 increases by a little over twofold. So that's about 2.25x, which is what 5 heat and 12 heat are doing to NF-kappa beta, will increase that SCD1. And so now think back to that study in Germany from 1968. So when you see polyunsaturated fat dropping, what's happening is that polyunsaturated fat is being converted to 5 heat and 5 oxo-EAT. And those are things that activate NF-kappa beta and PPAR gamma. And NF-kappa beta and PPAR gamma are both involved in increasing these lipogenic enzymes and these lipogenic transcription factors. And of course, one of the things that those lipogenic enzymes do is they convert stearic acid, right? This is what SCD1 does. It converts stearic acid to oleic acid. And so there you kind of have the whole pathway, right? The omega-6 linoleic acid is being converted to signaling molecules, which are increasing this enzyme, SCD1, and SCD1 is converting stearic acid to oleic acid. Let's look at it again. Here we are in Germany. As people become obese, saturated fats dropping, right? Polyunsaturated fats dropping. This is getting converted by delta 6 desaturase to 5 heat and 5 oxo-EAT. And the monounsaturated fat is increasing. Saturated fat is decreasing because SCD1 is converting this to that. This is another paper. This is yet another mechanism of action. This 5 oxo-EAT actually triggers this other ox-EAT receptor, which is involved in inflammation and asthma and cancer. And 12 heat has its own receptor that's involved in cancer and diabetes. And so you're probably wondering what affects heat levels, what affects D6D activity levels. Well, one of the things is your genetics, and one of the things is the amount of dietary PUFA that you consume, or dietary linoleic acid. Of course, even though high tissue linoleic acid is sort of good in the context that everyone is eating the same amount of linoleic acid, does not mean that you should eat more linoleic acid, right? Because linoleic acid is actually the fuel. It's the thing that gets converted to 5 heat. I love the study. It was done in Finland, and the Finnish diet is pretty low in linoleic acid. And so these people on the baseline diet, they're consuming 8 grams per day of linoleic acid. They have this divided into 2 different genotypes. So this is genetics here. So one group, so there's 2 copies of the gene. You can either have both copies be the T allele, or you can have both copies be the C allele, or you can be somewhere in the middle. But they left out the people in the middle. They only measured kind of the 2 extremes because they wanted to show a more dramatic result. And so these are the 2 different versions of this one gene that you can have. And what happens is this 12 heat, in the people eating 8 grams a day, the people with the TT allele have more 12 heat than the people with the CC allele, right? By about 50%. So that's a pretty big jump. And of course, this allele is associated with diabetes risk and all kinds of bad things. So if you have the TT allele, you are more likely to get diabetes, and you're going to have more 12 heat. Also, 15 heat is 0.31 instead of 0.26. And I'm not going to talk about these keats. We'll skip those for now. And when you look at 5 heat, again, the people with the TT allele have a little bit higher 5 heat than the people with the CC allele. And so what they do in this test is they give people for 4 weeks this high PUFA diet. So now they're eating 30 grams a day of linoleic acid. And you can see that what happens is So in 12, with the TT genetics, they go from 6.16 all the way up to 8.35. And so you see this very real increase in the amount of these oxidized PUFA as you increase PUFA consumption. And these people with the CC gene go from about 3.6 up to 6.2. And so in all cases, if you have the TT genetics, you have more of these oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, but also in all cases, the more linoleic acid you eat, you have more linoleic acid metabolites. And so this is a really nice study that shows the interaction between genetics and diet in the real world. And another thing that affects D6D activity is the amount of PPAR alpha that you have. One of the target genes of PPAR alpha is delta 6 desaturase. If you have high PPAR alpha activation, you are going to have high delta 6 desaturase activity. This slide I stole from the Emergence diet. This is the active season. This is grizzly bears in July. They don't have a lot of PPAR activity. As they approach hibernation and then as they go into torpor, you see that PPAR alpha levels really increase. One of the triggers for that is consuming dietary oleic acid. And so when you consume oleic acid, you release this signaling molecule called OEA, which is a cannabinoid. And OEA actually inhibits your insulin metabolism, and it does this by activating PPAR alpha. So when you activate PPAR alpha, it begins that process of making you insulin resistant and getting you torpid and getting you ready for winter. So PPAR alpha is activated by all the fats that you consume and also all the fats that are stored in your body fat. And you can see here, so these are the monounsaturated fats. This is palmitoleic acid that we talked about, and that's oleic acid. And you can see that these monounsaturated fats activate PPAR alpha quite a bit. And here's your saturated fats. C18, that's stearic acid. This is palmitic acid. This is myristic acid. And you see that down here, they don't activate PPAR alpha. In fact, at high levels, they actually inhibit it. And here's your polyunsaturated fats. So linoleic acid does not activate PPAR alpha to the same extent as monounsaturated fat. But this is 18,3 omega 3. So this is alpha linolenic acid, actually activates PPAR alpha a great deal. As animals approach torpor, as people become more obese, they have more and more oleic acid, and that's putting them more into that PPAR alpha torpid metabolism. This is a study in Spain in a nursing home, and I did show this in How Olive Oil Makes You Fat. What they did in this experiment in a nursing home was the cafeteria swapped out the food which had all been being made with sunflower oil, and they traded that out for olive oil. And so you see this switch from linoleic acid, which I said doesn't activate PPAR alpha, and they switch the diet to olive oil, which is mostly oleic acid, which releases OEA and does increase PPAR alpha. So PPAR, one of its target genes, is delta 6 desaturase. And you can see here, right, here's our product to precursor ratio. So this is when everyone's diet is being made with sunflower oil, and you can see oleic acid is at 12.9 and GLA is at 0.26. And then as they switch to virgin olive oil, what happens is the linoleic acid drops, and that might just be because they're consuming less linoleic acid. But the thing is that GLA increases pretty significantly. So that means that the D6D index goes from 0.020 to 0.031. So that's about a 50% increase in D6D activity because they went from linoleic acid to oleic acid as the primary dietary fat. If you've read my blog or watched any of my past videos, you will know that I consider this NADH to NAD plus ratio to be a huge issue. And the NADH to NAD plus ratio, which I also call reductive stress, well, it's called reductive stress. This will absolutely drive forward that reaction of delta 6 desaturase. So here again, we have our delta 6 desaturase reaction converting 18,2N6 to 18,3N6. And what happens is this reaction uses a molecule of NADH and it produces an NAD plus. And so what that means is if you have a lot of NADH, this reaction is going to happen faster. This is essentially going to drive that reaction forward. Of course, you can use oxidants to bring down that ratio of NADH to NAD plus. If we look back again, NADH, this is the reduced form. NAD plus is what they call the oxidized form. When I talk about oxidants, what I'm talking about is things that oxidize NADH to NAD plus. So these are the oxidants that I recommend. RALA, I don't have for sale, but that's a really good one that I strongly recommend. That will get down that NADH to NAD plus ratio in your mitochondria. Pyruvate's another good one. I have succinate and alpha-ketoglutarate for sale at fireinaBottle.net/shop. And I would recommend using either of those with RALA. I think the RALA is that important. The RALA is the first step of getting that mitochondrial NADH to NAD plus ratio down. And that gets the enzymes that these things rely on deacetylated. And these guys can then really help to drive that process forward. Another thing is DHA and fish oil, or just consuming fatty fish. DHA is a long chain omega-3. Those fish oils, those long chain omega-3s that you get in marine oils and fish oils can compete somewhat with those enzymes like D6D and D5D. And so this is a study in humans that were given 5 grams of fish oil for 6 weeks. And you can see here's their D6D activity. It actually goes from 0.17 at the start of the study all the way down to 0.14. So that's, I guess, about a 20% decrease in D6D activity. That's a really good thing. One of the interesting things about this study is it shows a drop in linoleic acid, which I've been saying is bad, except the reason in this case the linoleic acid is dropping is that it's being replaced by omega-3 fats instead of because they're getting converted to 5-HETE. You can see the EPA in particular goes from 1% of fats up to 4% of fats. So that is replacing the linoleic acid. Lastly, polyphenols. You know, when we think about the bears emerging in the spring, those polyphenols are a seasonal signal that it's time to get out of torpor. It's time to start responding to insulin again. One of the enzymes that is downstream of delta 6 desaturase is this enzyme called CYP1B1 that is responsible for making a lot of the 5-HETE and the 12-HETE and the 11-HETE and the bad sort of oxylipins that are associated with obesity. The expression of this is controlled by the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, and a well-known blocker of the aryl hydrocarbon receptor is resveratrol. And so in this study, they used the cell line, and what they did was they increased resveratrol from here 1 micromolar to 5 micromolar to 10 micromolar, and they're using dioxin to activate the aryl hydrocarbon receptor and increase this CYP1B1. And as they increase the amount of resveratrol, the amount of the enzyme that converts linoleic acid to the bad things like 5-HETE decreases. Here's another study. This time they actually look at 5-HETE levels and 9-HETE levels and 8-HETE levels. And so again, they do something here to activate. It's the same thing. It's the CYP1B1. So this is aryl hydrocarbon receptor in action. You can see 5-HETE here. They give it this thing called ANG2. You see this massive jump in 5-HETE levels, but as you add resveratrol, which is what these 3 bars here are, when you add the resveratrol, that 5 heat level goes way back down. Here's another study looking at these polyphenols. And so these polyphenols, apigenin and luteolin here, are pretty common. Quercetin and myristin. I've talked about myristin in former videos. When you see very low numbers here, like 0.027 or 0.016, that means these things are pretty good at inhibiting CYP1B1. And so a lot of these dietary polyphenols are also good at blocking the aryl hydrocarbon receptor and reducing this CYP1B1. And so for all you real nerds who really want to see what's happening, here's how this all works. So the AHR actually is the transcription factor that activates both PPAR alpha and CYP1B1 that I just showed. PPAR alpha activates delta 6 desaturase. Of course, delta 6 desaturase takes linoleic acid and it converts it to arachidonic acid. We'll just call that AA. CYP1B1 takes that arachidonic acid and it converts it to, let's say, 5-HETE. There's another enzyme that comes along and converts that to 5-oxo-HETE. This 5-HETE activates NF-kappa beta. This 5-oxo-HETE activates PPAR gamma, which is like a little Y. And these two things, when activated, like I say, they increase SCD1, and SCD1 converts stearic acid 18O to 18-1. And so, as I say, even looking back at a German study, an American study from 1943 and a German study from 1968, what you can see are these saturated fats decreasing, and that's typified by a drop in stearic acid. You see these oleic acid increasing, and you see linoleic acid dropping. And these enzyme systems can explain all of that, as well as their effect on obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Thanks for watching. Come back next week.